Is it the moss-soaked hush of trees bearing witness to silent fugitives? Or the thunder in the chest of a woman who became more than myth, who became a road, a rhythm, a redemption? Somewhere between the cypress and the whippoorwill, between rusted chains and the scent of freedom carried on the salt wind, she walked barefoot, again and again, into the jaws of hell just to guide another soul home. They called her Moses, but her real name was Harriet, and her story is not just history. It is scripture whispered by grandmothers. It is rebellion wrapped in prayer. This is not a story of escape. This is the gospel of return of a woman who could have stayed free but chose to come back. Again, and again, and again. She didn't just steal bodies, she carried legacies. And in the hush of midnight, when the swamp breathes and the stars lean low, her memory still sings like a hymn. God told me to run, so I never stopped. She was born beneath trees that groaned when the wind passed through them, beneath stars that refused to fall, beneath a God who saw, even when the world looked away. They named her Araminta, but the fields gave her another name, Minty. A name passed on soft lips under breath, in places where white men couldn't hear. She took her first breath in Dorchester County, Maryland, near the Blackwater River, where the moss draped from the trees like mourning veils, and the earth knew too much sorrow to ever dry completely. Her father, Ben Ross, tall and rooted like an oak, worked in the timber fields. Her mother, Rit, bore her children with love and raised them with dread that one day one might vanish before supper, bought and sold like cattle, never to be held again. Minty's earliest memories were not of toys or lullabies, but of whispered prayers and slammed doors, of mothers pressing damp cloths over their children's mouths to silence a cry when the patrollers came too near. She was 5 when she first saw a man whipped for trying to visit his wife. She remembered the sound of the leather, not the crack, but the silence afterward. How even the birds seemed ashamed to sing. Minty never forgot that silence. She'd hear it later in the woods in the moments just before someone escaped or died trying. Her house was not a house. It was a shanty patched with tin and cloth. Rain fell through the roof in thin silver lines. Cold crept up through the floorboards like memory, but her mother's voice could warm the whole room. "Don't let this place make you small," Rit would whisper, pressing a hot comb to Minty's scalp on Sundays, even if they had no place to go. "Your soul is too big for these chains." Rit taught her to pray not like the preacher, but like the river, steady, patient, unafraid. When Minty was 7, she was hired out, loaned like a book, read by hands that didn't care if she tore. The mistress was a woman whose heart had gone dry years ago. She sent Minty to fetch muskrats from traps in the freezing water, though the child's skin cracked and bled. She made her clean without soap, carry without shoes, bow without being spoken to. Minty slept on the floor by the hearth, curled next to the fire like a forgotten log. One night she stared so long into the flames she swore she saw them dance. And in the center a shape, a man, a woman, no, something beyond. A voice spoke, not with words but thunder. She did not scream, she blinked, and the fire whispered back. The cruelty of men came next. She was hired to a dry goods store. There she saw a man, another slave, run in desperation. The overseer ordered Minty to block the door. She didn't move. So he hurled a 2-pound iron weight meant for him. It struck her instead, right between the eyes. They said she should have died. She didn't. Instead, she slept for days. When she woke, the world was different, tilted, sacred. Sometimes her legs buckled. Sometimes she fell mid-task, lost in a seizure. But while her body shook, her spirit soared. She began to dream of paths no one else could see, of stars moving like signposts, of rivers whispering names, of a God who held her hand in the dark. The masters called her useless. They cursed her, beat her, traded her like a problem that couldn't be solved. But Rit knew. She saw the fire in her daughter's eyes, knew it wasn't madness, it was calling. At night, Rit would press her forehead to Minty's. They'd sit by the hearth in silence. "You're seeing things others can't," she'd whisper. "Don't let em steal that from you." Minty learned to listen, not just to words, but to whine, to trees, to the silence between steps. Her faith became a compass, her pain a prophecy. Sometimes she would lie awake listening to the sound of chains, not hers, others. They moved in the night, rattling like old ghosts, a family being moved, children sold, a woman dragged from her husband's arms, her screams tearing the dawn. Minty would press her face into the straw mattress, but the screams still came through. Some nights she'd bite her hand until it bled just to stay quiet. It was then she began to whisper back to God. "I hear you," she'd say. "Use me." Years passed. She grew into herself like a tree learns the bend of the wind, not broken but shaped by pain, rooted by love, driven by the voice that would not leave her. She was no longer a child. She was not yet free. But she had seen what freedom looked like in her visions, in her dreams, in the way her mother's voice quivered when speaking of the North. "Follow the river," Rit once said. "It knows how to carry you." And Minty knew then she would not die on Maryland's soil. She watched the skies. She watched the stars. She listened for a sign. And in the fire again a whisper, "There will come a night, and when it comes you must rise." She didn't yet know her name would change, that she would become Harriet, that she would carry others on her back. But she had seen the sky burn and it did not frighten her. She had heard the voice of God and it did not break her. She was Minty, daughter of Rit, child of chains, bearer of visions, and even in bondage the sky above her never bent, not once, not ever. There are some wounds that do not close, not because they cannot, but because they become openings. She was still just a girl when her skull cracked open beneath the weight of iron. Still learning how to carry water without spilling, how to keep her eyes low and her anger lower. And yet that blow did not take her. It woke something. From that day forward, Araminta Ross Minty did not simply see the world. She saw through it. The weight had struck her at the store, thrown by a white man chasing another slave. It cracked bone and spilled blood across the wooden floor. She collapsed without sound. Some said she stopped breathing. Others said she whispered words they couldn't understand. She was carried back like a broken tool, laid down on a splintered bench with no doctor, no comfort. And there in the dimness, her spirit began to walk. She dreamed of fire that did not burn, of rivers that moved backward, of voices that spoke without mouths. She saw people she had never met and somehow knew their names. She saw chains fall and doors swing open, and a people walking through tall grass toward a light too bright to be the sun. She dreamed, and the dream stayed. When she woke days later, her eyes had changed, wider, darker, deeper. As if she had returned from a place no one else had been. They said she was sick, said she was broken, said she was touched, and they were right, but not in the way they feared. She had been touched by prophecy. The spells came without warning. One moment she'd be walking barefoot through the pines, the next, collapsed in the dust, eyes fluttering, lips moving, sweat cold on her neck. She called them her sleep spells. But they weren't sleep. They were instructions, visions, warnings. God speaking through a hole in her skull that pain had carved. She was mocked, feared, loaned out even more as if her seizures made her worth less, not more. And yet with every collapse her spirit rose stronger. One day she dreamed of a river flooding, and the next, the fields overflowed from a storm no one had predicted. She dreamed of a road cut through the woods, and later found a hidden trail she'd never seen before. They called it coincidence. She called it revelation. Her mother, Rit, believed her. "God don't speak through the strong," Rit said. "He uses the wounded. That's how we know it's him." At night, they'd sit together in the dark, no candle, no sound, and Rit would say, "Tell me what he showed you, baby." Minty would whisper of hands reaching through jail bars, of boats drifting silent across water, of a woman walking barefoot with children strapped to her back, and no one able to stop her. Sometimes Minty wept. Because the visions were heavy, because freedom costs more than blood, because she saw herself in every shadow. She began to pray with her whole body, not the quiet, folded hand kind, but the trembling kind, the sobbing, kneeling, rocking kind, the kind that cracked open the earth. "I can't read, Lord," she once prayed aloud in the woods, "but I can feel you, so speak where I can feel." And the wind rustled the leaves in answer, a rhythm, a pulse, direction. Sometimes she'd stand in the middle of the fields and lift her face to the sun with her eyes closed. And in that stillness, she'd feel it again, that invisible thread tugging her forward. She didn't know where it led, but she would follow. Because God had chosen her not for her strength, but for her willingness. Others began to notice. A cousin said, "Minty don't flinch like the rest of us. She already seen the worst." A field hand said, "She talkin' to spirits." And the masters. They looked at her with suspicion. A slave that wasn't afraid. A girl that stared you down like she knew your secrets. Dangerous. They tried to sell her, but no one wanted a sick girl who collapsed without warning. So they kept her a girl with a broken skull and unbreakable will. The spells never left, not even years later when she ran through the swamps with fugitives behind her. Not even when her name became whispered across counties like a hymn. But she learned to live with them, to trust them, to rest when they told her, to move when they stirred her. She said the Lord would wake her in her sleep and tell her which road to take. Sometimes she turned around mid-journey, dragging others with her through thorns and cold water. And every time the path they would have taken was found to be a trap. How do you explain that? How do you measure visions? You don't. You live by them or you die without them. In those early days, Minty was still shackled, still waking up before dawn to labor, still aching with the weight of the world on her back. But she began to move differently. Slower, more certain. As if each step was guided by something older than time. The children feared her spells. The old ones bowed their heads when she passed, and yet somehow she brought peace. There was a holiness about her as if she walked in two worlds at once. She could smile and make you feel like tomorrow was possible. Then in the next breath, she'd fall to the ground, arms outstretched, eyes rolling back. And when she rose, she'd seen something no one else had. That crack in her skull had become a window. And through it the spirit sang. She never forgot the pain, never forgot the weight, but she stopped fearing it. Pain became her teacher, visions became her lantern, faith became her shield. She began to hum spirituals with new meaning, not just to comfort but to signal. Each note became a message, each rest a warning. The other slaves began to listen. Because Minty didn't just hum about heaven, she hummed about roads and stars and where to find the Lord in the trees. One day she woke from a seizure and told Rit, "God said I'm gonna run, but I won't run just for me. He said I'm comin' back." And Rit, with tears in her eyes, just held her because she knew the wound hadn't weakened her, it had named her. No one yet called her Moses. No one yet followed her into the woods with nothing but trust. But the Spirit had already whispered her mission. And when the time came, when the stars aligned, when the voice in the fire said, "Go," she would rise. Not as a servant, not as a slave, not even as a woman, but as a conduit, a vessel, a whisper between worlds. The girl with the cracked skull would become the map, and the road would remember her feet, forever. There comes a night when silence becomes unbearable, when the earth itself pushes you forward, when the air feels like a whisper saying, "Now, go." She had waited through hunger, through grief, through the sail of her sisters. Waited through the thunder of men's boots on wooden floors and the prayers that never seemed to reach the sky. But when the moment came, it was quiet. No shout, no angel, just a stillness in her chest and the voice that had guided her since the blow to her skull. "Get up, you must leave, tonight." In the year of 1849, Minty Ross fled the plantation. She did not tell her mother, she could not. To say goodbye would have broken her. She simply rose before the cock crowed, wrapped her feet in rags and stepped into the night. Behind her, everything she had known. Ahead, nothing but darkness, a north star and the God who had never left her side. She walked barefoot at first, through brush, over roots, across fields littered with broken tools and broken dreams. The air was thick with summer heat, but she moved like water, silent, flowing, bending but never breaking. Somewhere a hound howled. She froze. Felt her heart pound so hard she thought the trees might hear it. But the wind shifted, and the voice came again. "Keep walking." She passed through the swamps near the Blackwater, water up to her knees, leeches clinging to her calves. The moon cast silver trails on the surface, but she dared not follow light. She followed the shadows. At one point she sank waist-deep in mud. A snapping turtle brushed her leg. Still, she did not cry out. She simply prayed, "Lord, hold my tongue, hold my feet, hold my soul." She found shelter beneath an overturned boat. A family of field mice scattered at her arrival. There she rested, but only briefly. Sleep was not safe. So she hummed softly, the melody of a spiritual her mother once sang while kneading cornbread. It calmed her. And perhaps it calmed the trees too. On the second night, she met a stranger, a black man with tired eyes and kind hands. He was part of the Gospel Railroad, what they would later call the Underground. He gave her a name she could use, Moses' sister. He gave her bread, a slice of dried apple. Then, pointing to the woods behind his barn, he whispered, "Follow that path till you see the sweet gum trees. Stay low, trust the dark." And with that he vanished, like an angel sent for a moment. She walked for over 90 miles, 3 weeks, through fields and forests, over fences, past snake pits, under stars that seemed to blink just for her. Her feet bled, her skin peeled, her stomach ached, but she never turned back. She remembered what she had seen in her visions, a road north lined with angels in human skin, a land where her name would mean something. And then, at last, Pennsylvania, freedom soil. Crossed the state line with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fire in her soul. She stood there, breathless, and for the first time in her life she exhaled without fear. She said later, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person." She had been remade not by freedom, but by the journey toward it. She chose a new name. She shed minty like a skin. Now she was Harriet after her mother, Rit. She added Tubman, the name of her husband, John, though he would never follow her. She took it anyway, not for him, but for the sound of it. Harriet Tubman, a name strong enough to carry others, a name that would echo across time. In freedom she worked, washing floors, cooking for wealthy white families, saving every coin in a cloth tucked beneath her bodice, not to live, but to return, because something burned in her chest. Freedom tasted bitter when she knew her family still knelt beneath the lash. She had escaped, but she had not been delivered, not truly. God had told her, "You are not free until your people are free." And Harriet obeyed. She began to study the maps passed hand to hand in prayer meetings, memorized the stars, learned the herbs that could silence a baby's cry. She listened to every whisper about safe houses, watched the patterns of slave patrols, marked the rhythms of the tides. Freedom, she learned, was not an accident. It was an art, and she would become its master. Some begged her not to go back. "You've earned your peace, Harriet." But peace wasn't what she wanted. Justice was, she said. "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would take the other." She bought a pistol. She packed dried cornmeal, smoked ham, and a Bible. Then she knelt by the riverside and prayed, "Lord, make me strong, make me invisible, make me thunder." And with that, Harriet Tubman walked back into the South, not as prey, but as a storm. No chains on her wrists. No fear in her eyes, no doubt in her step. The girl who once watched the sky burn had become the woman who would burn a path through the swamps. And though no one called her Moses yet, the river already knew her name. The river does not speak, but it remembers. And when the time came for Harriet Tubman to return to the land that enslaved her, the river parted its reeds like it was welcoming her home. It knew her steps. It knew her silence. It had watched her run once, trembling, barefoot, and now it watched her return not as prey, but as deliverer. This time she was not alone. In the belly of the swamp just outside Buckton, 3 men waited. One of them was her brother. The others, too afraid to speak above a whisper. They had agreed to run, but now, beneath the trees that groaned like grieving mothers, they hesitated. Too dangerous, they said. Too late. Too far. Harriet did not raise her voice. He simply looked them in the eye and said, "Go back if you want, but I'm going to freedom, and if you come with me, I'll lead you there." They followed, not because they believed, but because she did. The water became their cover. She led them through creeks, down cattail paths only she knew, across flooded trails that swallowed their ankles and numbed their legs. The river carried their scent away from the dogs. Its hush muffled their footsteps. Its bends hid them from white eyes. Harriet had learned the language of water. She knew when it lied. She knew when it warned. She knew when it wept. Every journey was a hymn, not sung but lived. They moved at night, rested by day, pressed flat beneath thickets or hidden inside churchyards where the tombstones leaned like old prophets. She gave each escapee a false name. She taught them how to walk without leaving a trail, how to read the moss, how to listen to the wind. A snapping twig meant danger. An owl's cry in the wrong place meant a spy. They were not just running. They were being reborn. In Caroline County, a black preacher smuggled them into his wagon under layers of hay. In Delaware, a Quaker woman with silver hair fed them cornbread and milk. In Wilmington, they met Thomas Garrett, a white abolitionist who gave Harriet boots and a compass. She didn't need the compass. The Lord had already mapped the stars inside her. The road north was not a road. It was a tapestry, stitched by grandmothers who left quilts on fences, by field hands who sang coded verses, by black watermen who rode in silence, by white farmers who left tea. Ere lanterns burning in just the right window. Each journey was a miracle, each miracle made of many hands. Harriet made her second trip and then a third. Each time she came back to Maryland, she risked death. Each time she left with souls wrapped in trembling and hope. She never lost a passenger, not once. And when asked why, she said simply, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." The masters called her a thief, said she stole property. But Harriet didn't steal. She rescued. The people she led were not things. They were dreams. They were ancestors in the making. And the river, it bore witness. One night they crossed a marsh so still the stars reflected in the water like shattered glass. A baby stirred. Its mother, shaking, looked to Harriet. If the child cried, it would be over. The hounds would come. The men, the chains. Harriet reached out her hand, not to silence the child, but to hold the mother. She sang, softly, low, a song her mother had once sung to her. And as her voice moved through the reeds, the baby slept. The night held its breath, and they moved on. Words spread like scripture. They called her Moses. A name made of reverence and fear. A name white men cursed and black children whispered before bed. Posters went up, wanted dead or alive. They described her as short, scarred, possibly insane. They did not understand that her power was not in size, but in spirit. She could not be bought. She could not be caught. She moved with purpose, and the land moved for her. On one journey, she hid in a pig pen for 2 days. On another, she slept inside a coffin at a friendly undertaker's. Once, she wore men's clothes, face darkened with ash, passing through a busy street while bounty hunters waited 1 block away. She did not tremble. God had told her, "You are not theirs to catch." The North Star became her ally. It hovered in the sky like a promise, guiding her from Maryland to Philadelphia to New York to Canada. But no matter how far she traveled, her soul stayed in the swamps. Each journey pulled another family out, a husband, a daughter, a brother. Each journey left her more tired but more whole, because with every soul she carried, she reclaimed a piece of herself. She did not keep records. She did not write diaries. The work was too sacred for paper. She carried it in her body, in the limp she bore after years of walking through ice and thorns, in the scars on her hands, in the dreams that woke her crying. History would try to measure her, but history could never know the nights she walked soaked to the bone, whispering verses to children too scared to breathe. She once said, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything." And that glory. It followed her back into the darkness every time she returned for another. The river still remembers. If you walk near the Blackwater marshes today, when the mist rolls low and the nightbirds go quiet, you might feel it too. A rustle in the cattails, a hush in the wind, a presence just out of sight. It is her, still walking, still guiding, still free. And always the water parts. The auction block was not made of stone. It was made of screams, stacked and smoothed by generations of grief. There, under the hot southern sun, black bodies were laid bare, teeth checked like mules, breasts fondled for breeding, children torn from mothers with casual cruelty. And the blood soaked into the wood until the platform itself groaned with memory. This was the altar where America fed its hunger. And one day it called out to Harriet Tubman. The news came like a storm. Her niece, Keziah, was to be sold, auctioned off in Richmond, Virginia, along with her 2 young children. They were to be separated. Split like firewood, scattered across plantations like leaves in the wind. Harriet in Philadelphia at the time felt her chest clench. The voice came to her again, "You must go now." This was not a simple rescue. This was a declaration. Harriet would defy the system openly. She would strike at its heart and steal life from the jaws of capital. She boarded a southbound train under a false name. With her, she carried forged freedom papers and a pistol tucked in her skirts. She had never been to Richmond. She did not know the layout, but she knew the scent of danger and she had learned how to move with God. Keziah had been placed on display in the city square, a black woman of calm dignity standing with her babies beside her as white men appraised her like livestock. They offered prices, high ones. She was young, healthy, fertile, a field hand, a future breeder, but Keziah's eyes remained on the horizon. She had been told that help might come. And when Harriet slipped through the market crowd dressed like a housemaid, no one looked twice. Harriet approached the platform slowly, her hands hidden in her apron, her eyes cast low. She whispered, "Keziah, we moving tonight." Keziah's breath caught. Her youngest child clung to her hip. The elder one stared wide-eyed, sensing the holy shift. No plan, no map, only faith. They would run. That night, as the city drank and laughed, they slipped away. Out the back door of the trader's holding house, into the alley, into the dark. A free black man, a carpenter who had helped Harriet before, waited with a horse cart covered in hay. Keziah and the children climbed in. Harriet joined on foot, silent as smoke. They rode through the night, then boarded a boat at dawn, disguised as a family in mourning. A coffin sat between them, empty but not meaningless. They passed checkpoints. White eyes glanced, then looked away. No one searches the grief-stricken. No one questions the dead. By the time the auctioneer raised his gavel the next morning, the woman he meant to sell was already gone. He shouted, cursed, offered reward, but the tracks had already been swallowed by the river. When they arrived in Philadelphia, Keziah wept, not for what was behind her, but for what had almost been. Her sons clung to her legs, free and whole. Harriet did not weep. She simply looked to the sky and said, "Thank you." Then she turned around because there were others. This chapter of her life changed everything. Harriet had not just led fugitives through the woods, she had robbed the system in daylight. A black woman had outwitted the auction block, and now she would do it again. She began to study the rhythms of the slave markets, their calendars, their routines. She learned that auctions were often held on Mondays, that Saturday nights were best for escapes, overseers drunk, patrols lazy. She memorized prices, watched the trends, but what she studied most were the faces of mothers watching their children dragged away, the faces of men whose daughters were bought by traders, the blank stares of girls too young to understand what the bidding meant. And every time she saw those faces, she burned. She couldn't save them all, but she could save some, and every one she did was vengeance. She returned again, this time for a friend's sister, then for a cousin, then for a family of 5. She moved like the tide, leaving behind no trace but whispers. Sometimes she bought train tickets in different names. Sometimes she walked miles through snow. Sometimes she rode in the back of carts full of turnips. But always she arrived. And always she left with more than she came for. The system tried to adapt. Posters were nailed to trees. Slave catchers were paid in gold. Still she slipped through. Because Harriet was not just one woman, she was an apparition. A story passed from hand to hand. She was thunder wrapped in cotton. She was Moses. Each time she stood before the auction block, even in disguise, she remembered the wood, the flies, the breathless weeping of a mother trying not to scream. And in those moments her jaw would tighten. Her fingers would brush the pistol hidden in her waistband. And she would vow, "I'll never let another child be sold without a fight." Her rescues became legend. Children who should have been sold south now walked barefoot in the snow toward a future they could barely imagine. Fathers reunited with sons. Old women carried on stretchers across state lines. Harriet did not care how hard the journey was. She only cared that they walked it together. She became bolder, and with boldness came power. Black families whispered her name around campfires. White masters hissed it in rage. To the north, she was a symbol. To the south, a nightmare. To the enslaved, she was the hand of God. But Harriet never claimed glory. She would say, "'Twasn't me, 'twas the Lord. I always told him you got to go with me, and he always did." Still, the blood on the auction block cried out. It never ceased, and Harriet heard it even in her sleep. Sometimes she dreamed of babies sold in pieces, of women too old to be chosen, of boys beaten to silence. She could not save them all, but she could remember them. Every time she walked past a market, every time she opened her mouth to pray, She prayed not just for the living but for the forgotten, and they walked with her every mile. There was a day when she passed through a southern town wearing a shawl head bowed, pretending to limp. She passed the auction house. Men stood laughing, smoking cigars. And for a moment Harriet stopped. Not long, just enough to look, and in her eyes not fear but fire, because she knew every soul she led north was a hammer against that block, and one day it would crack. There's a baptism that does not happen in churches. No choir, no candles, no clean white robes, only mud, only fear. Only the soft breathing of fugitives pressed into the roots of trees as the dogs howl in the distance. This was the kind of baptism Harriet gave. Not into water, but into deliverance. And the swamp, it was her sanctuary, to the white man the S. Wamps of the eastern shore were danger, serpents, quicksand, disease, a place to avoid. But to Harriet they were sacred ground. God's camouflage, where the trees bent low to hide the desperate, where moss muffled the steps of the fleeing, where every cattail and frog cry became part of the chorus of freedom. They came to her in twos and threes. A mother with a newborn, a teenage boy with lash marks on his back, an elder with a twisted ankle and fire still in her eyes. Some had run for the first time. Some had tried before and been dragged back in chains. But all of them, everyone was ready to risk death for a taste of what Harriet had touched. She met them by moonlight, never in the same place twice. Sometimes she wore a man's coat. Sometimes she disguised herself as a washerwoman, always armed, always alert, and always carrying something more powerful than a gun, certainty. She never said maybe. She said we will make it, and they believed her. Their journeys began with silence. No names, no questions, only the crunch of leaves, the rustle of water, the sound of breath being held again and again, like lungs were too afraid to be loud. One winter night she led a group of 6 through the woods beyond Buckton. The frost bit their feet. One man bled through his shoes. A child whimpered. Harriet crouched low, her face inches from the girl S. "Think of the morning," she whispered. "Think of waking up and not seeing chains on the wall." The child closed her eyes, and they walked on. The swamp was no easy friend. They waded through waist-deep water, skin turning blue, leeches clinging like curses, mosquitoes swarmed, snakes coiled. Once an alligator slid silently beside them. Harriet raised her hand. No one moved. It passed. God was with them. At night she built fires so small they barely warmed the hands. They shared cornbread and dried apple, passing pieces like communion. She taught them hymns, but never to sing aloud, only to hum, low and steady, so the Lord could hear but the hunters could not. She was hard when she needed to be. Once a man insisted on turning back, too tired, too scared. Harriet pulled her pistol, leveled it at his chest. "You go on with us," she said, "or you die here." Not because she wanted to kill him, but because his fear could kill them all, and he understood. He kept walking. Sometimes faith had to wear steel. One night they hid inside a hollow log for hours, still, cold. Just feet away, 2 patrollers passed. They joked about bounty, about skinning runaways. The youngest girl in the group trembled. Her mother put a hand over her mouth. And Harriet. She prayed, not in words, but in will, and they were not found. The next day the sun rose like an old friend, and in its light Harriet knelt by the river, cupped water in her hands, and let it pour down her face. A washing, a renewal. One by one the others did the same. Not a ritual, not a ceremony, but something holier. A swamp baptism. She knew every route, every bend, every trick of the terrain. She'd been walking these paths for years, with eyes open and spirit listening. He placed pine cones in the fork of branches to mark turns. She used owl calls to signal allies. She scraped messages into tree trunks with a dull knife. This was not just escape, it was warfare, and Harriet was a general. In one mission, she guided a group during a thunderstorm. Lightning split the sky. Mud soaked their clothes. A boy slipped into a ditch and cried out. Harriet grabbed him, lifted him with more strength than her size should have allowed. The others pulled branches to help. They moved as one. That night they huddled beneath a fallen tree. Harriet led them in prayer, not deliver us tomorrow, but thank you for delivering us already. Because faith for her was not about what might happen, it was about what had already been promised. Some died on the way, a man too old to keep pace, a woman bitten by a copperhead, a child drowned in a crossing. Harriet carried their names with her like stones in her apron. Every success was sweet, but the losses never left her. They visited her in dreams, in the rustling of the swamp, in the nights when no one came, and yet she returned. Every time she could have stayed in the north, she could have rested, she could have built a life with windows and warmth. But she chose the path that bled because she had been chosen, because her visions would not let her sleep, because her God was not one who said, "Stay safe." He said, "Go back." Each group she led was a new scripture, not written in ink, but in footsteps, in trembling hands, in bloodied cloth, in laughter when they crossed the line. Each crossing was a resurrection, each arrival a gospel. She never claimed to be a preacher, but her gospel was written in the earth, and the swamp her altar. One man who walked with her said later, "It was like being born again, like everything I knew was washed off me in that mud." Another said, "She didn't just save me, she made me believe I could be a man again." There were no hymns for these journeys, no historians standing by, but if you listen now on quiet nights when the air is thick and the frogs begin to sing, you might hear something in the dark. Not a voice, not a song, but a feeling, like the earth remembering a miracle, like water parting for one more soul, like the footsteps of the deliverer moving through the reeds, still leading. She never asked to be called Moses. But the name came anyway, whispered in the cornfields, scribbled in panic on plantation walls, spit through clenched white teeth at candle-lit meetings of desperate slaveholders. There's a woman. She walks through locked doors, takes them in the night, leaves behind nothing but footprints and freedom. Mothers began to tell their children, if you hear a hymn in the dark, follow it. It might be Moses coming. But Moses was not a man. Moses was a woman with a scarred forehead, a limp in her step, and the eyes of someone who had seen the other side and come back burning. By 1856, she had returned to the South dozens of times, each trip more dangerous than the last, and the system that fed on human flesh could feel her slipping through its ribs. Slaveholders called her a menace, a ghost, a criminal. They offered a $40,000 bounty, a fortune for her capture, dead or alive. But no one could catch what they couldn't see. Harriet moved like smoke. She changed her gait, her name, her voice. She'd pose as an old man or a grieving widow or a field cook looking for work. Sometimes she carried chickens and would let them loose to distract slave catchers. They'd chase the bird and she'd disappear. Other times she walked boldly through towns, dressed in fine clothes, smiling at white men too drunk or too proud to notice the flame under her bonnet. She knew the laws were shifting. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had turned the entire country into hunting grounds. Even in the North, runaways could be snatched and dragged back south. No jury, no mercy, so Harriet adapted. She began leading her people farther to Canada, where American laws had no grip. The journey grew longer, colder, riskier, but her resolve grew deeper. She told her passengers, "You'll be free or you'll die." And she meant it. Some nights she carried opium to sedate crying infants. Other nights she carried a hammer to pry open the cellar doors of safe houses in a hurry. Always she carried a pistol. She said it wasn't for the slave catchers, it was for the runaways who might lose their nerve. No one goes back, she told them. No one, because turning back meant betrayal. Turning back meant death for them all, so she became the one who would not flinch, the one who stared into fear and never blinked. They called her Moses, but she did not part seas. She parted night. She parted chains. She parted families from sorrow, children from torment, souls from captivity. And she did it not with miracles, but with dirt under her nails and sleep deprivation in her bones. Still, the threats grew louder. In towns across Maryland, rumors flew, "She's in disguise. She travels with dogs. She's a conjure woman protected by spirits." Slave patrols doubled. Bloodhounds were trained with fresh clothing from captured runaways. But Harriet was always gone before they sniffed the first scent. There were nights she walked with the moon at her back and the river before her, with nothing but stars to guide her and the faces of the living behind her. She moved with a rhythm like breath, and every step said, "Keep going." Her network grew. White abolitionists, black freedmen, Quakers, ministers, dock workers, they all passed her word. If she sent a bird call at midnight, you opened the cellar. If she knocked 3 times and said, "Hannah," you fed her and her people. If she left a bundle of sticks outside the fence, you knew to pack food. These weren't just codes, they were sacraments. She didn't run an underground railroad, she ran a holy procession. But not everyone supported her. Some thought she was reckless, others jealous of her fame. There were whispers, even among abolitionists, that she was too poor, too uneducated, too wild. Some men, full of theories and speeches, dismissed her as just a field woman with stories. But stories don't raise bounties, and legends don't move through swamps with fugitives unless they're real. She met Frederick Douglass once. He told her, "I have had the applause of the crowd, but you have had the midnight sky and the silent stars as witness." He knew. They all knew. Harriet did the work when no one was looking. Still, danger crept closer. One informant betrayed a safe house. Another revealed the path she often used, so she changed her routes. Every mission now was a gamble, and yet she kept coming. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for strategy meetings, didn't consult newspapers. She moved when Odd said move, and that made her unstoppable. On one journey, she led a man whose chains had only recently been cut. He still bore the smell of the slave pen. He still jumped at every crack of twig. But Harriet stayed close. At the border, he collapsed to his knees. "I didn't think I could do it," he said. And Harriet, with tears in her eyes, replied, "It wasn't you, it was the Lord." What the South didn't understand was this: Harriet wasn't running people north. She was running judgment through the backroads. Every life she rescued was an indictment. Every step through the marshes was a testimony. Every sleeping child she carried was a promise kept. They could offer silver, they could offer gold, but they couldn't catch her, because the spirit that walked with her was not one that could be bribed or chained. Even now, if you walk the old trails near Dorchester County, you can almost feel it, a breeze that carries warning, a hush in the trees that says, "Someone passed here." And if you listen close, really listen, you might hear the faint echo of him beneath the wind. "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." And somewhere in the dark, Harriet's steps continue, not slowing, not stopping, still walking free, still leading, still Moses. There is a kind of war that does not begin with muskets but with memory. It happens not on open fields, but in kitchens, in parlors, in houses that look quiet from the outside, but hold fire beneath their floorboards. After years of pulling others from the abyss, Harriet Tubman tried to live in peace. But even in freedom, the fight followed her. She settled in Auburn, New York, in a small wooden house she bought with borrowed money and a blessing. The house leaned slightly, as if it too had walked a long road. The yard was wild, the paint peeled. But to Harriet, it was a temple. It was the first roof she had ever owned. The first door she could lock without fear that someone would sell her children. She planted vegetables. She took in orphans. She fed whoever knocked. But rest would not stay. Freedom, she found, came with new chains, poverty, doubt, disrespect. White abolitionists, once full of praise, grew silent. Donors stopped giving. Politicians smiled but turned their backs. She had risked everything, yet now she was treated as a relic, a symbol, not a woman. But Harriet did not bend. She turned her house into a safe haven, a battlefield in the war for dignity. She took in the sick, the aged, the abandoned. She nursed them, fed them, wept with them. At night, she prayed aloud not for comfort, but for justice. In 1859, she was gifted a plot of land by Senator William Seward, a rare moment of recognition. On that land, she built a home for the aged, for those who had been cast aside by freedom's false promise. Old black men with hollow eyes, women who had once nursed white children now sleeping on floors. She saw them, and she said, "You will not die forgotten." But even as she poured herself out, America descended toward war. The drums of secession began to beat. The South feared rebellion. The North argued law and money. And in between millions of black bodies still bound, Harriet watched. And when the war came, she did not hesitate. She traveled to South Carolina, where the Union Army had taken coastal lands. There, Thousands of newly freed men and women gathered in makeshift camps, sick, starving, uncertain. Harriet stepped into this chaos and began to organize. She washed the wounded. She taught women to cook and sew. She set up makeshift hospitals with herbs she knew from the swamps. But that was only the beginning. She began working with Union generals, men who had read about her, but now saw her in action. She gathered intelligence, listened, moved through Confederate towns in disguise, mapped trails, identified rice plantations where enslaved labor powered the rebellion. They were stunned by her accuracy, but Harriet had always seen what others overlooked. In Troy, New York, years earlier, she had led a different battle. Charles Nall, a fugitive slave, had been arrested by U.S. Marshals. Crowds gathered. Tensions rose, but Harriet pushed through. She broke into the building, led a mob through the streets. Charles escaped twice in the same day. She was knocked down, bloodied, but unbroken. The newspapers called it a riot. But it was a rescue, and it would not be her last. In every city she spoke. Churches, halls, corners where black mothers gathered to sell baked goods for survival. She raised money not for herself, but for her mission. Still, she often returned home with empty pockets, because Harriet gave and gave and gave, until only her name remained. But the world began to change. The Civil War split the nation. Men marched. Blood spilled. And Harriet, with fire still in her bones, prepared for the next chapter. She stood on the porch of her house one morning, watching the fog rise. Child tugged her skirt. "Miss Moses," he said, "is it true you fight like a man?" She looked down. "No," she whispered. "I fight like a woman, and that's enough." Her house would never be quiet. Even in old age, wounded veterans came seeking wisdom. Journalists knocked looking for stories. Young women came to sit at her feet and listen to her whisper. "Don't wait for permission. Do what must be done." Harriet once said, "I had reasoned this out, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would take the other." But now she fought for a new kind of liberty, dignity, and freedom. They tried to forget her, tried to bury her beneath praise without support, statues without shelter, but she did not fade. She became louder in her silence. Visitors to her home often noticed the Bible worn thin, the chair by the fire worn smooth, the back door always slightly open, as if she still expected someone to come through it needing refuge. And someone always did. One winter she caught a fever, laid in bed for days, drifted between visions, murmured names no one else recognized, and when she woke she laughed. "The Lord said I ain't done yet," she said. "He still got roads for me to walk." So she walked, with cane in hand, with stories in her mouth, to Congress, to schools, to the back porches of old women still braiding hair into maps. She reminded them all, freedom is not an end. It is the beginning of battle, and her house, it became a monument. Not of marble, but of mercy. A battlefield made of bread and prayer, a place where justice wore aprons and healing smelled of herbs and wood smoke. They had called her Moses, a name made of miracles, but in the end she was something deeper, a mother of freedom, not just of escape, but of what comes after. The house still stands, and if you step inside you might feel it, that still burning fire, that promise. That battlefield where she still fights, in memory, in legacy, in every child who dreams of something more. Some women were born to cradle life. Others were born to carry war on their shoulders like a mantle of divine wrath. Harriet Tubman, small in frame, scarred in body, limping with every step, walked into the Civil War not as a soldier, not as a nurse, but as something altogether unprecedented. A black woman sent by God to lead men into battle. It was the summer of 1863 in South Carolina. The swampy banks of the Combahee River coiled through rice plantations where thousands of enslaved people still toiled under Confederate guard. Union generals had plans, maps, men, but they lacked one thing. They lacked the knowledge of those waters. And Harriet, she knew rivers like scripture. She had walked them by moonlight, slept in their reeds, crossed them with children on her back and dogs in pursuit. She did not just know those waters. They knew her. By then, Harriet had already proven herself. She had worked for the Union Army as a nurse, treating black soldiers left to rot in field tents. She deboiled herbs into poultices, soothed fevered heads, dug graves for those no one else would claim. She had served as a cook, a laundress, a spy. She moved between plantations, gathering intelligence from the enslaved, names, weapons stockpiles, trap placements, food stores. She passed it on in whispers, tucked inside hymns, buried beneath Bible verses. She was a woman turned weapon. But on the Combahee, she would become something greater, a commander. The plan was this. Using intelligence she helped gather, Harriet would lead 3 Union gunboats up the river at night, through narrow channels packed with torpedoes, toward the heart of Confederate-held territory. Once there, they would launch a raid, destroying supplies, burning crops, and most sacred of all, freeing every enslaved soul they could find. The generals hesitated. This was risky, daring, uncharted, but Harriet didn't blink. She stood before those white officers not as a supplicant, but as a woman who had already survived more than war could offer. "I'll take the lead," she said, and they let her, because even the army could feel it. She walked with something holy. On the night of June 2nd, the boats moved silently through the darkness. Union soldiers crouched low. Harriet stood at the helm, her eyes fixed forward, her lips moving in silent prayer. The river shimmered under the moon, but she could sense the mines buried beneath. She guided the boats through narrow sloughs and hidden channels, just as she had once guided fugitives through swamps. No wrong turns, no explosions, only forward. As they neared the plantations, Harriet gave the signal. Soldiers leapt ashore, torches were lit, barns burned, storehouses collapsed. Confederate guards scattered. But the most powerful moment came not from fire, but from footsteps. From cabins and fields, from thickets and shadows, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children emerged. Some still holding hoes, some barefoot, some weeping. They had heard the sound, the sea. All the promise, Moses had come. Harriet shouted instructions, to the boats, to freedom. She lifted children into rowboats, calmed mothers who clung to babies. One elderly man collapsed at her feet, crying, "Be blessed, Lord, be blessed, Lord, it's the day of Jubilee." They carried sick women, blind elders, newborns wrapped in tattered cloth. More than 700 souls fled that night. Not one returned. The Union soldiers stood in awe. They had expected bloodshed, resistance, maybe 50 or 60 rescues. They had not expected an exodus. They had not expected Harriet. She returned to camp exhausted, her clothes damp with river water, her hands scraped raw. But in her eyes, fire. The newspapers would barely mention her name. The official records would name the generals. The medals would go elsewhere. But those who were there, those who had seen her in the thick of it, they knew. They had seen a general in a skirt. The Combahee raid was a turning point. It crippled Confederate supply chains. It bolstered Union morale. And it gave Harriet what she had always sought, souls delivered, children who would never be auctioned, wives who would never be whipped again, men who would die on their own terms, not in someone else's field. And yet she returned to poverty. After the war, Harriet applied for a military pension. She was denied, over and over. No record of formal enlistment, they said. As if the river had not watched her lead. As if the children she saved were not enough. As if medals meant more than miracles. But Harriet never fought for gold. She fought for God. And for every man who walked free, for every child who saw morning, for every mother who held her baby tight on the Union boat, she had already been paid. Later in life, a reporter asked her, "Weren't you scared going into battle like that?" Harriet smiled. "I was scared," she said, "but I never let it stop me. I never lost faith, and the Lord never let me fall." There is a photo of her from those years, standing straight, eyes defiant, a scarf wrapped around her neck like armor. She does not smile. She does not need to. The gaze alone says, "I have walked through fire, and I brought others with me." The Combahee River still flows, still bends through South Carolina like a memory. And when the sun sinks low and the wind rises across the reeds, some say you can hear the faint splash of boats. And if you close your eyes, you might just see her, standing at the bow, torch in hand, calling the enslaved to rise one more time. There are graves that hold silence, and there are graves that whisper still through the wind in the trees, through the rusted chains left at the edge of old rivers, through the names carved into stone by hands that once trembled, then rose. Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, in a small white house in Auburn, New York. She was surrounded by family. some she had raised. Some she had rescued, some she had simply loved into freedom. Her last words were not of regret, not of pain, but a prayer. "I go to prepare a place for you." She was old by then, her back curved like a river bending home. Her legs, once strong enough to carry souls through swamps, now trembled beneath her. But her spirit, it was still fire. Even in her final years, Harriet worked. She spoke at churches and rallies. She raised money for her home for the aged, where she herself would one day rest. She fought for veterans' pensions, not just for herself, but for the black men who had bled beside her in the war. She attended women's suffrage meetings, sitting beside the likes of Susan B. Anthony, though she never received the same spotlight, because Harriet did not fight for praise. She fought for promise. When the government finally granted her a pension, it was $20 a month, a number that mocked her legacy. But Harriet never lived by numbers. She lived by names, by faces, by the sacred memory of those she had freed. Her funeral was simple: a pine box, a black church choir, veterans in uniform, children weeping softly. They laid her down beneath a canopy of oaks not far from the house she had built with faith and sweat, and for a moment, just a moment, the earth stood still. But her story did not end there, because Harriet Tubman's grave is not a place of rest. It is a drumbeat. Decades later, visitors began to leave coins at her headstone. Pennies, nickels, quarters, not for payment but for honor. Children touched the stone and said, "She looked like me." Elders brought their grandbabies and whispered, "She never let the fire die." Artists painted her, poets praised her. Activists invoked her name before marching into tear gas, because Harriet did not belong to the past. She belonged to struggle itself. In Selma, her spirit marched. In Montgomery, her footsteps echoed. In Ferguson, her fire returned. In every protest, every song, every whisper for justice, she still walks. She walks in the girl who lifts her voice at the school board meeting. In the man, W.H. O votes though his ancestors could not. In the mother who teaches her son his true name, not the one the world gave him. Harriet lives in every act of defiance that begins with love. Some try to reduce her story to escape. But Harriet did not escape. She returned, again and again, because deliverance means nothing if it is not shared. She could have stayed free, could have lived out her days in safety, but freedom without her people was a cage in another form, so she walked back through fire. Because her freedom was not hers alone, it was a bridge, and she became the plank beneath the feet of the frightened. Today in Auburn, the cemetery is quiet. Snow falls soft in winter, leaves tremble in autumn, but beneath the soil something burns, not death, but memory, sacred, unfinished. They placed her beneath a simple stone, "Servant of God, well done." But if they had written the truth, it would stretch across sky and soil. Here lies the woman who would not bend, who walked into the night with nothing but prayer, who split rivers with will, who turned herself into a road for others. And still, the fire breathes. In classrooms where children learn her name. In libraries where her eyes stare from history books. In streets where her descendants chant, "We are the children of the ones who would not die." Somewhere tonight, a black girl lies in bed, eyes open, fists clenched, wondering if she is enough. And in the silence, Harriet's voice comes, "You are more than enough. You are chosen. Now rise." And somewhere a black boy runs not from fear but toward his dreams, feet pounding the pavement like a heartbeat. And the ground remembers, it whispers, "She walked here too." Harriet Tubman is not gone. She has simply stepped beyond time, still carrying the babies, still whispering to the mothers, still holding the hands of the weary. And if we listen not with ears but with spirit, we can hear her even now. The work ain't done. But neither am I. Her grave is not a tomb. It is a torch. Still burning, still guiding, still singing. Some stories do not end, they echo, not in history books, but in the hush before dawn, in the hush where black mothers weep for sons still chained by systems, in the hush where freedom is still a whispered hope. Harriet Tubman walked so many into deliverance that her name became more than a name. It became a path, a pattern, a prophecy. She was born into bondage, and yet she never belonged to it. She was struck but not silenced, sold but never broken, feared but never found. And in that scarred, starlit body, God placed a compass that no map could outdraw. There are footsteps in every forest, hymns in every hollow tree, codes written into rivers that still remember the ones who dared to cross. And when you walk anywhere through city streets, through quiet fields, through schools or courtrooms or fires of your own, you carry her with you. Because Harriet did not die, she multiplied. She is the dream in your chest when the world tries to crush it. The whisper in your blood that says, turn back for them, even if it kills you. She taught us that faith walks when sight fails, that freedom is a fight, not a gift. That love, real love, goes back into the dark until everyone is out. So tonight, as the wind bends the trees, as the moon rides low over the rivers that once knew her name, listen. Not with your ears, with your soul. Because the fire was never buried. And somewhere deep inside the soil, beneath chains rusting in the earth, beneath stars that once watched a woman walk north, it still burns.